Chapter 2. Psychology. Before proceeding with the consideration of the main questions, it will be necessary to lay the foundation by a brief statement of the fundamental principles of psychology from which some of my conclusions will be derived. It will be seen, in subsequent chapters, that the basic facts of elementary psychology and those of organic evolution are identical. But we will first consider some of the fundamental principles of psychology as developed by the researches of modern science. In 1893, I published my first work, entitled The Law of Psychic Phenomena, in which I tentatively formulated a working hypothesis for the systematic study of all psychological, or, more specifically, psychical phenomena. That hypothesis was the result of more than 30 years of systematic search for an underlying principle, which I had the faith to believe must exist, and which would, when found, correlate all psychical phenomena, and possibly remove them all from the domain of superstition. More than 6 years have elapsed since the publication of that hypothesis, and as no fact tending to disprove it has yet been brought to my attention, I feel warranted in assuming its correctness, and carrying it to its legitimate conclusions in every field of psychological inquiry. For a full discussion of the hypothesis and its application to psychological phenomena in general, I must refer the reader to my work above mentioned. It will be necessary, however, to make a brief summary of it here, in order to make my meaning, in other parts of this book, clear to those who are not familiar with my earlier works. The evidences of the correctness of my hypothesis, which were set forth in my 2 former works, one will not be repeated here, except where it becomes necessary for the elucidation of the text. But further evidences will be adduced which will in themselves be conclusive. The first proposition of my hypothesis may be stated as follows: man is endowed with a dual mind, stated thus conservatively. The proposition will not be seriously questioned by any student of psychology who has kept pace with the discoveries of modern science. I prefer, however, to state it provisionally, thus: man is endowed with 2 minds. I prefer this method of stating the proposition for 2 reasons. First, because it appears to be true. That is to say, everything happens just as though it were true, and this is all that any scientist pretends to expect in a working hypothesis. Secondly, I prefer it because it admits of clearer treatment, inasmuch as it requires less of roundabout phraseology to express my exact meaning. The conclusions derivable from the proposition are, however, precisely the same, whichever way it is stated. I adhere, therefore, to my usual way of expressing it, and state, as my first proposition, that man is endowed with 2 minds. I distinguish them by designating one as the objective mind and the other as the subjective mind. The objective mind is that of ordinary, waking consciousness. Its media of cognition are the 5 physical senses. Its highest function is that of reasoning. It is specially adapted to cope with the exigencies of a physical environment. It is the function of the brain, and the brain is the ultimate product of organic evolution. This, it may be remarked parenthetically, is the mind with which materialistic scientists deal when seeking to demonstrate, by means of the scalpel and other appliances of experimental surgery, that even the soul itself cannot survive the onslaughts of medical science. The subjective mind is that intelligence which is most familiarly manifested to us when the brain is asleep, or its action is otherwise inhibited, as in dreams, or in spontaneous somnambulism, or in trance or trance-like states and conditions, as in induced somnambulism or hypnotism. Anyone who is at all familiar with the phenomena resulting from any of these mental conditions is aware that the most wonderful exhibitions of intellectual activity and power often result. The significant feature of the phenomena is that, other things being equal, the intellectual powers thus displayed bear an exact proportion to the depth of the trance, to use a generic term, or, in other words, the more completely the action of the brain is inhibited, the more phenomenal will be the manifestation of intellectual activity. Thus far I have not traveled outside the range of common observation and experience, especially of professional men. But it must be admitted that these facts alone make a prima facie showing of duality of mind. There are thousands of illustrations of the law which amount to demonstrative proof, but they cannot be discussed in this connection. It may be remarked, however, that materialistic scientists themselves have demonstrated, some of them unwittingly, that the brain is not the organ of the subjective mind. In later chapters of this book, it will be shown that the proposition is demonstrated by the facts of organic and mental evolution. The second proposition is this: the subjective mind is constantly amenable to control by suggestion. The meaning of this is that the subjective mind involuntarily accepts as veridical the ideas or statements of fact imparted to it. These statements or ideas may be imparted orally by another person, in which case they are called suggestions, or they may arise from the education of the individual, in which case they are termed autosuggestions. There are no exceptions to this law, although there are some apparent exceptions. But it will invariably be found that the apparent exceptions are the clearest possible illustrations of the absolute universality of the law. A common illustration of the power of oral suggestion by another is witnessed when a hypnotist declares to his endormed subject that he is a third person. The alacrity with which the subject accepts the suggestion and the marvelous fidelity to nature with which he will personate the character suggested are among the most striking phenomena of hypnotism. Again, a striking illustration of the force of an autosuggestion arising from the education and belief of the subject is afforded by so-called spirit mediums. They are self-hypnotized psychics, and the suggestion arising from their education and environment is that, when they are in the subjective state, they are controlled by disembodied spirits. This suggestion is accepted, of course, and the supposed spirit is personated with the same marvelous fidelity to nature that characterizes the performances of the hypnotic subject. A corollary of the law of suggestion is that the subjective mind is incapable of inductive reasoning. That is to say, it is incapable of instituting an independent inquiry by the process of collecting facts for the purpose of reasoning from them up to a general principle or law. Under the law of suggestion, it must obtain its data or premises from the objective mind. Besides, it possesses a higher power than that of induction, a shorter road to essential truth, namely, the power or faculty of intuitive perception. This subject will be more fully treated hereinafter. The following table exhibits in condensed form the results of a complete analysis of the faculties of the two minds, accredited to the objective mind: inductive reasoning, imperfect deductive reasoning, imperfect memory, brain memories of emotional experiences. Accredited to the subjective mind: instinct or intuition, controlled by suggestion, potentially perfect deductive reasoning, potentially perfect memory, seat of emotions, telepathic powers, telekinetic powers. In undertaking an analysis of the faculties of the two minds, one broad and pregnant fact stands forth in bold relief, and that is that the only faculty which belongs exclusively to the objective mind is that of inductive reasoning. The other objective faculties set down in the list, namely, the power of deductive reasoning and of memory, are the necessary concomitants of induction. The reason is obvious. Deduction is a necessary concomitant of induction, for the objective process of reasoning consists in alternate induction and deduction. And memory is an indispensable concomitant of induction, for the obvious reason that the latter presupposes facts to reason from, and memory is the storehouse of facts. It will be observed that these faculties, the concomitants of induction, are shared by the subjective mind, the difference being largely of degree. That is to say, they are inherent and perfect in the subjective mind, whereas in the objective mind they are exceedingly imperfect and depend for their degree of development primarily upon laborious cultivation and, secondarily, upon constant refunctioning as a means of keeping them in a state of efficiency. Other faculties belonging primarily to the subjective mind, e.g., the emotions, are represented versus the brain. Scientists tell us that every faculty, every emotion, has its specialized cortical area. This is doubtless true, but whether they will ever succeed in correctly locating all the brain centers is another question. Be that as it may, our emotional experiences, as well as all other experiences that rise above the threshold of normal consciousness, are registered in the brain. That is to say, each conscious experience creates new brain cells, which in the aggregate constitute the brain memories of our experiences. But they are only memories. They are simply stored up facts for the use of the inductive powers. They complete the objective mental organism. The seat of the emotional faculties is, nevertheless, in the subjective mind, where, as we shall see later on, it was located eons before a brain was evolved in the process of organic evolution. It will thus be seen that the aggregate of the faculties of the objective mind constitutes pure intellect. They are simply the faculties of reason and judgment. They constitute the judicial tribunal of the dual mind. When properly cultivated and developed, they sit in judgment upon every act of our earthly life. They regulate every emotion, they restrain every passion and direct it into legitimate channels. In short, reason is at once the tenure by which man holds his free moral agency, and the power which enables him to train his soul for weal or woe in this world and in the world to come. It is obvious that the faculties of the objective mind pertain especially and exclusively to a physical environment. It was evolved in response to physical necessities, just as all other natural weapons of offense and defense were evolved in the great struggle for life. It could be of no possible advantage as a part of the mental equipment of the disembodied soul, which is endowed with the godlike faculty of intuitive perception of that fundamental truth which the objective mind must seek by the slow and tedious processes of inductive inquiry. It should neither surprise nor alarm us, therefore, when material scientists demonstrate the fact that the objective mind, being the function of the brain and inherent in that organ, necessarily perishes with the body. It will, in fact, become apparent, as we proceed, that the subjective mind is the primary intelligence with which all sentient creatures are endowed. For it existed untold millions of years before a brain was developed in the process of organic evolution. It is also the ultimate intelligence of man, for it survives the death of the body and the consequent extinguishment of the objective mind. The latter, as before remarked, is a product of organic evolution. Like every other physical weapon of offense or defense, it was evolved in response to the necessities of a physical environment. It is specially adapted to such an environment, and to no other. Its powers of inductive reasoning enable man to grope his way through the mazes of an environment of ignorance and uncertainty, and gradually to distinguish between the true and the false in the realm of physical life. In that life it is the most potent agency known to man, for it enables him gradually to acquire a knowledge of some of the laws of the physical universe, and thus ameliorate his physical condition. In the realm of human laws and human government, it also finds ample scope for all the powers it can ever possess. But it is of the earthy. Before closing this brief summary, it may be well to remark that, whilst the two minds are each capable of independent action, they often act in perfect synchronism. This accounts for many otherwise inexplicable phenomena, those of genius being the most conspicuous examples. The specific means by which this synchronism is effected, or how it is that the subjective mind exercises its power to inhibit the action of the objective mind, is not at present known. We can only be certain that it possesses that power by observing the phenomena, that of hypnotism alone demonstrating the power of the subjective mind to inhibit the action of the brain. Cerebral anatomists have not yet studied the subject from the standpoint of duality of mind, and hypnotists are not agreed upon the condition of the brain of a hypnotized subject. The old school of hypnotists still adhere to the idea that the brain must necessarily be the instrument through which all intelligence is manifested. As long as scientists adhere to that idea, there never can be any substantial progress made in experimental psychology, for if psychic phenomena teach anything worth knowing, it is that the brain is not the organ of the highest intelligence in man. The subjective mind, the organized intelligence of the human soul. I repeat, therefore, that the subjective mind is the primary intelligence of all sentient creatures and the ultimate intelligence of man, whereas the brain is a specialized physical organ of which the objective mind is the function, and it pertains as exclusively to this life as does any other physical organ or function. It controls the subjective mind in all the ordinary affairs of this life, in everything except in matters of conscience and the primary instinct of self-preservation, because it is specially adapted to the exigencies of a physical environment. This it does by virtue of the law of suggestion. But by virtue of the same law, the subjective mind can totally inhibit the action of the brain, just as it can inhibit all sensation in the body. Just how this inhibition is effected, it is not my present purpose to inquire. I leave that to the cerebral anatomists, who will someday awaken to the realization that they have a potent intelligence to deal with that is not of the brain. It is probable, however, that the inhibition is effected by the simple process of withdrawing the blood from the brain, as in ordinary sleep. Be that as it may, it is certain that the subjective mind not only possesses that power, but it can assume control over every nerve, muscle, and fiber of the body. Ordinarily, it exercises habitual control over the involuntary functions only, leaving the brain in control of the voluntary movements, but in cases of imminent and deadly peril it inhibits the action of the objective or reasoning mind, and seizes upon the whole nervous and muscular system. In such cases, feats of almost superhuman strength and agility are performed, pain is inhibited and fear banished, until the crisis is past. Little need be said, in this connection, about the faculties of the subjective mind, as they will be dealt with more at large in subsequent chapters. Their names are indicative of their functions, and all that needs to be said in this connection is that, unlike the objective mind, each one of its faculties and powers is obviously indispensable to the complete mental equipment of a disembodied spirit. Not one necessary faculty is lacking, and not one faculty is superfluous, and not one faculty belonging exclusively to the subjective mind performs any normal function in the physical life.